Okay. So we're going to go over the React Context API again. You guys got exposed to it on Thursday. We'll see another example. So does anyone happen to know why, like, what is the Context API? Like, okay, so what is it and what is it for?
I guess it has to do with components sharing information between each other.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so it's about sharing information, yeah, among components, exactly. Okay. But is there, I mean, can't we already do that?
I think it's a way to go around passing props.
Yeah, okay, good. So it's a way to avoid passing. So if we want to pass information from one component to another, then the way we do that is props, right? So if I want some information to change within a component, I use state. And if I want to give information from one component to a child, it has to be a child, then I use props. So one, let's say, inconvenience that can happen is that you start getting, so I'm kind of modeling that here, you start getting applications that are deeply nested, lots and lots of components. And you might have a case where you need to pass props from this component down to this component, and you have to pass it through all these different intermediaries, and these components don't need that information. So this component, this top level component, has some information that this component down here needs, but it has to go through these. And this could be, you know, some arbitrarily long sequence of components. Could be, you know, here there's 2, it could be 100 or 10, depending how complicated your application is. So the React Context API basically exists to make this a little bit more convenient. So before we look at the using the Context API, let's just make this work using what we know about props and state and everything else. So I'll walk through this just real quickly. So we have this app.js. So this is all going to be functional. I'm just going to do this functionally. If someone wants to see it as a class, then let me know, but I'm just going to do this functionally. So we have our app component. It's got some bit of state. So this is going to represent a user being logged in. And this is just kind of a dummy value. You just click the button and log in. This, you know, represents some more complicated thing that you might actually do. But the user can log in or logged out, and depending on whether or not a user is logged in or out, the user should or should not be able to see this protected page. The issue is that whatever this protected page is actually nested a few levels down. So well, I should have cleared this out before. So we have this app, it's got state representing whether or not a user is logged in, and we need to get this piece of information down to the component that actually needs to use it. So I'll go through quickly. So intermediate 2, it's not doing anything interesting. Intermediate 1, sorry, intermediate 2, also not doing anything interesting. Then we have this gatekeeper component, which is basically in charge of rendering or not this protected page. Right now, it's just rendering it because it doesn't really have the ability to conditionally render it or not. Doesn't have the information it needs. So we need to get whether or not the user is logged in to this gatekeeper. So how do we go about doing that?
Well, without using the context, you'd
Yeah.
have to pass some sort of credentials or logged in status all the way down, and
Okay,
then do your conditional rendering.
good. So how do we do that? So we're starting at the top level app.
Pass the is logged in value as a prop in the intermediate one.
Okay. So is logged in. Okay, so now we're passing it. So if we can look at our dev tools now, I can see that this information that I want is state in the app, and it gets passed down. Now it's getting passed down to intermediate one, but I need it in gatekeeper. So I go to intermediate one, and then what do I do?
Same thing,
Okay,
but with the props dot syntax.
yeah. So is logged in. So I have a couple options here. I can try to do is logged in directly. That doesn't exist. I could do props dot, but that won't exist yet either. So I have to pass that in here. So I can either pass in the entire props, or I can pull out specifically what I need. I can use destructuring. So I'm going to use destructuring because in this example, you can imagine that there's all kinds of props that we're passing in, and maybe this just needs a couple of them. But so I'm just going to do is logged in. So I'm going to pull out just what I need here, and then I can access it directly. So now intermediate 2 should also have this state, which it does. And this gatekeeper component is going to need that. So I'm going to go to this component, and I'll have to do the same thing. So I'll destructure the props to get the is logged in. And then I can pass that in here. Okay, so now Gatekeeper has access to this, and I can see that right here. So this protected page, what I want to do is either render this Gatekeeper should either render this protected page or not. So I have in intermediate 2, I'm passing this in, and Gatekeeper now has it. So if I go to Gatekeeper, how can I decide to either render this or not? So how would Gatekeeper, what information does Gatekeeper need to make that decision?
You can use the same props command, and then
Yeah, structure. So we're gonna need the is log. So let's check and make sure that Gatekeeper now actually has that. Okay, good. So Gatekeeper had it before, but now we can access it inside the component. Okay. So if the user is logged in, I want to render this, otherwise I don't.
You could do is logged in $& product page.
Okay. There's a couple ways to do that. I think this is the kind of the most concise way of doing it. But you're free to use, just regular if. This is a return, so you can do if something, return this, else return something else. So you can, have entirely separate return statements if that's clearer for you. Either way will work. But I think this is the simplest way of doing it. So is logged in, we're going to check it. If it's true, we're going to render this page. Otherwise, we're going to get nothing. So we have this either do it or not, which is basically the use case for this double ampersand. It's either going to be one thing or nothing. if you have two options rather than just one, then you can use the ternary operator. Okay, so let's see if this works. So right now I am not logged in. So is logged in is false. And if I log in, then gatekeeper, this is logged in as true, and gatekeeper will render this prop right here. Are there any questions about that so far? So this is an example of a prop that we need, and we could imagine this again. We can imagine this being arbitrarily deep, but this is a piece of information that we need to go from one component through a bunch of components and then into another one. So this is kind of complicated, right? It would be hard to maintain. So the maintainability issue comes in with this. So in order for gatekeeper to work correctly, it's not just, it's got a long chain of dependencies. So if something goes wrong with this, if I want to change this, then I also have to change this, which means I also have to change this. And you could imagine if there's 10 more components. So if you want to change something, you have to keep track of lots of other things, which is just an invitation for mistakes and bugs and so on. So ideally, we would like to avoid that kind of long chain of dependencies. But I just want to also reiterate that this works, right? This works. This is normal React. You can do this and it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. So one problem, we have one kind of problem situation, which is we have deeply nested components that we need to pass props. So they're called like prop drilling, deeply nested props. Another use case that might be a problem is if we want every component to have certain information. So if we want, let's say, every or most component to have certain information, we would have to, let's say, we wanted every component to know about whether the user is logged in. We'd have a similar issue, or we'd have to pass that prop in to everything all the time. And if we ever changed, if we ever changed it, again, we'd have to go into every single component that consumes it, and we'd have to change it there. So it just makes maintenance more complex. Okay. So if possible, we would like to avoid this long chain of intermediate dependencies, and that's where the context API comes in. So it's totally optional. It's a convenience, but what it does is it kind of allows you to create another component. So this context component, and you can put your state or whatever you want. You can put it inside this context component, and then you can directly access that anywhere else in your application. So that's a real advantage. So what you would do is you would take whatever state you want, let's say the state that's an app, and I'm going to create a new special kind of hidden component called, like a context provider or context consumer. So I would take my state and I would put it in some secret component or hidden component, and then I could consume it. So I would create a component that that stores the information, and then if I wanted to use it, I would put that right next to right above the component that wanted to use it, and then I could get it directly from there. So I could bypass this, however many levels of intermediaries that I have. So that might sound a little abstract. We'll look at an example right now. Are there questions about that so far? Okay. So we're gonna not pass in all these props. So I'm just gonna, I can get rid of that, I think. One, and I'll get rid of this. Get two. And this is not gonna be a prop anymore. Okay. So we're gonna have to, first off, we're gonna have to create our special context component. And React gives us a convenience function to do that. So just like with the hooks, we have, use state or really use state. So use state, we call it and we get returned right here, our state, and then a function to set the state. So React gives us a function to call that will create basically a component for us. So components are functions, and React gives us certain, at least in this particular case, it gives us this component. It's a special component, but still a component. Okay, so I'm going to go into source, and just for the sake of organization, I'm going to create another. So I have components. I'm going to create a context folder. In this context folder, we're just going to have one thing, but you could have lots of different contexts depending on how complex your application was. So we're going to add things. So we're going to add this component. We're going to create this component, and I'll call it user context. This could be anything, obviously, anything that you want to be essentially globally available in your app. So the user context, in order to do that, we're going to have to import, let's see, create context from React. So very convenient. We have this create context function. So I'm going to call that. Actually, this will be a component, so I'll capitalize this. User context equals create context. And that's basically it. So now I have created this component. So I think it's good to think of this as basically like if I had written a normal functional component called user context. And then just like any other component, I'm going to export it so I can use it. Okay, so this is this might look kind of bare, and you can definitely make this more complicated, but this is kind of the minimum you have to do. So we've called this create context function, which is the convenience that React gives us, and it's created this component called user context. So once we have our user context, we have to decide where we want to put it. So user context is a component, and this component has two subcomponents. It has a provider component and a consumer component. If you're using class-based stuff, you have to explicitly use the consumer. If you're using functional hooks, then you can skip the consumer part and just use the hook. So it's easier to use if you're doing functional components. But in both cases, you need to start with a provider, and the provider is just going to store. It's going to store that you're whatever you want. In this case, this is logged in. Okay, so if we think about where, we'll just look at this hierarchy right here. So where do we need to get our state? So the answer is in app. And where do we want to consume it? It's going to be down here in gatekeeper. So we're going to wrap everything that is going to lead to gatekeeper. We're going to wrap our top component, whatever contains the information that we want. in the provider, and then we'll use it in Gatekeeper. So here we have this app component. I'm going to do, so I'll have to import my user context. So import user context from context/user context. So now I have this component available. So user context, and it's not just user context. I can't use it as is. I have to use the provider that comes with it. And then I just wrap what I want here. And that is more or less it. Now the provider, we have to tell it what information we want it to keep track of. And we do that with this value parameter. And the value that we want to keep track, so this value could be anything, but in this case, we just have a single thing we care about. So we can pass this in directly. So is logged in. That's all we care about right now. Okay. So now at the top level, we have our app, and we've wrapped everything that that will eventually consume it with this provider, and we're passing it in the value. So now we have this context provider, which is storing the is logged in. Now to use it, we can skip all of our intermediaries and go directly to the component that we want to use that in. So we go directly to Gatekeeper, and we want to consume the context now. So this is a functional component, so we can use a hook. There's a convenient hook that we have access to. So import, and it'll be use context. So just like use state, use whatever, we have use context. And if we call use context, we're going to get back whatever this value is that we passed in. So this value, in this case, it's just a single, a simple, what's the word I'm looking for? Primitive value, but it could be, could be an object with a bunch of stuff on it, including functions and anything else you want to have. So const I'll just call it this for clarity, or to distinguish it. So use context, and then when I call use context, you can see in the signature here, it accepts a context object. Which means that I have to give it this, I have to pass in this context object. So use context knows specifically what context it should be using. So I'll have to import that. So import user context. So I have my user context, which in this case is basically going to be is logged in. So I'm going to change the name. Is logged in from text. We'll call it this. So we'll see that this now works. And if we look at the, we have this additional component, right? So we saw in the router, when we used the React Router DOM, that it gave us a whole bunch. So even if our application was simple, it adds a whole bunch of other components. And that's basically what it is. So it's allowing information to be passed around more easily. So we have this context provider component, and that's wrapping intermediate 1, which now doesn't have any props, right? So intermediate 1 doesn't have any props, intermediate 2 doesn't have any props, intermediate 3 doesn't have any props, but it has this, it has access to what would be props. So the context is false. If I click this, that changes and this displays. So now this application works exactly the way it did before, but I've eliminated the dependencies here. So I don't need, it doesn't matter what's in between the provider and the consumer. Are there any questions? That's basically it. So React context, if it's totally baffling and you're not interested, I would say don't worry about it. You don't need it. It's kind of a more intermediary React kind of thing, which would be good. You know, if you're interested in getting, like, if you're interested in getting better at React, it's definitely something you should be familiar with. But in terms of just getting stuff done, you don't need it. There are also other, so the context API comes built into React. There are other, so there are other solutions that do the same kind of thing. Some of them were around first, around before the context API. The context API was added relatively, not, you know, like a few years ago. So things like Redux, so state management things. So it's just a way of centralizing all of your state. But context API can do the same thing. So are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So right now, intermediate 2 doesn't have, like 1 and 2, I guess, don't have direct access to is logged in, or is it like
Yeah, right. They don't have. They don't.
So
They don't know anything about it, and our, you know, kind of imaginary use case, let's just say they don't care. So we can imagine where you have a web app and you have, like, you know, you want the ability to log in, but most of your page is going to be the same. And you might just have a couple things that are different depending on whether or not the user is logged in. So you want, you know, I want 90% of the page to be the same, but I just want, you know, a couple things to be different depending on if a user is logged in.
Gotcha. Thanks.
And you could just, you know, for the sake of completeness, you could also have, you can have multiple providers, you know, keeping track of multiple things, and you can also have multiple consumers. So I'm using this in this component, but we could also do the same thing if we decided, you know, actually intermediate 2 should also know about whether or not a user is logged in. You can just add this to intermediate 2. Now imports. And I'll just add this. Let's see. I need to do the normal things here. Yeah, let's see. Objects. Let me see. Let me just change that here. So now you can, so if we wanted, you know, again, if we wanted intermediate 2 to have access, we could do that. So it's pretty easy to add. So now whatever information we have about the user, in this case, just whether they're logged in, but this could be anything, could be a whole bunch of stuff. That's basically it's independent of the hierarchy that it's in. So we can just add, if we decide this component needs this thing, we just add it to that component directly, rather than, okay, I have to pass props to this one, and then to that one, and then to that one, and so on.
I've got a question.
Sure.
In the developer tools where it shows like hooks, context, false, is there any way to name these variables so that you know what's actually getting passed down?
Yeah, I think that I don't off the top of my head know how you do that, but I think there is a way to do that. Yeah, that's one of the inconveniences of hooks, but I think that there is a way to do it. Let me just see. Oh, I think, yeah, it's an option you can add or person. Let me see. Parse hook names. Okay, so you can turn that on.
Nice.
All right. Any other questions? So I mean, in terms of what it allows you to do, it's not really different. So you don't need it to make a React application. It's a convenience, especially when you have a very complicated application, and it's kind of an intermediate React concept. So you can take all that and decide what you want to do with it.
Is it pretty commonly used in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, some kind of state management, whether it's the context API or Redux or something like that. It's definitely common to have some kind of centralized state management in a production React app. Yeah. Okay. All right.